My favourite Wikileaks release is perhaps not what you might expect, in that it appears a slightly obscure subject, but within that it packs in a huge amount of information about the dishonesty of government, about the unpleasantness of people in government employment, um, and about the sheer cynicism with which foreign relations is conducted. It's one of the diplomatic cables from the US Embassy in London. And I should say, I was a diplomat for 22 years, and in that time, I read hundreds of diplomatic cables, or as in the UK we call them diplomatic telegrams, for every day, or at least 5 or 6 days a week. For 22 years, I read hundreds of these things, and 2 or 3 a week I would write. And it's called a cable or telegram. It's the basic form of diplomatic communication. This is how you communicate with other missions and with head office. This is the normal, routine way of communicating. And the style of the American ones, with summary, argument, conclusion, is exactly the same, and the drafting style very, very similar to the ones I would write myself. It's a standard format, which I guess is common to all diplomatic services. So there's a nostalgia for me personally in reading it. It's back in my old milieu. But the one which I've chosen is about the Chagos Islands, and it's fascinating because it's a conversation between the political counselor at the US Embassy and Colin Roberts, the director for dependent territories in the Foreign and Commonwealth Office. And it's dated 15th of May 2009. Its reference number is 1156, which means it's the 1156th cable written by the US Embassy in London back to the State Department in that year. It's also interesting to see who it's copied to. And again, it's exactly the same as the British system. You send the cable, you send it back to head office, the State Department or the Foreign Office, and then you copy it to other recipients. And this goes to a lot to, of course, to the Department of Defense, to the US Navy, because it's about the Chagos Islands and their base there, to the US Air Force, to the US Joint Chiefs of Staff. It also goes to the US Department of Energy, which is interesting because it's not theoretically about energy at all. It's about fish. But I was the other reason this is very interesting to me is I was head of the FCO maritime section, and myself dealt with this exact subject of the status of the waters around British dependent territories. And I always had to copy in and include and consult the Department of Energy, because the Department of Energy is interested in oil and gas reserves around UK dependent territories. And the only reason the United States Department of Energy would be copied in is that the US Department of Energy is interested in the potential of oil and gas reserves around the Chagos Islands, which is interesting because, to be honest, I didn't know there were any. But that's an interesting inclusion. To get onto the subject, what Colin Roberts, who initiated the meeting from the Foreign Office, is discussing with the US Embassy is the establishment of a marine reserve around the British Indian Ocean territory, where all fishing would be prohibited. Now, to understand this, because that sounds like a good thing, and many environmentalists were proposing it, and this was under the Labour government, and David Miliband was claiming it was a wonderful environmental step forward. But you have to understand the context. The Chagos Islands was the scene of perhaps the last great imperial atrocity of the British, when in 1972 the entire population was ethnically cleansed from the island at gunpoint, and their animals and pets were shot and left behind. The population were forced onto a steamer, sailed to Mauritius, and literally dumped on the shore. Entire population. They, of course, survived on the islands largely by fishing and a little agriculture. They were ethnically cleansed in order to remove the population and prepare the way for a huge nuclear weapon armed United States military base, which is still there on Diego Garcia. And later on, that United States military base was used as a key destination for extraordinary rendition and torture in the so-called War on Terror. So, this is a place of evil. And the British government was concerned that the islanders were going to the European Court of Human Rights, were lobbying hard in the British Parliament, were gaining traction in British media and public opinion against their ethnic cleansing, and they may win the right to return. But of course, if they were not allowed to fish, it would not be practical for them to return. They would not be able to make a living. So the idea was for Britain to declare its only marine protected zone where no fishing is allowed around the Chagos Islands, pretending to be an environmental measure, but actually to stop the islanders from ever returning, thus safeguarding the nuclear and torture base. Now, I had written about this. As I say, I used to be the head of the maritime section in the Foreign Office dealing with these issues myself. I had received information, from within the Foreign Office, from sources. I'd written on my own blog that this is what is happening. This is a trick. Environmentalists should stop supporting this. You are being used to support nuclear weapons and torture. And I, of course, had been called a liar. People claimed I didn't have sources, that this wasn't really happening, that I was making it all up. And that's why this telegram means so much to me, because it's yet another example where Wikileaks proves the truth of what is happening, proves how bad governments are. And here they're caught red-handed, explaining to the Americans that the purpose of this is to stop the islanders going back and that it will not in any way impinge on the use of the nuclear and torture defence base. It's also interesting to see the casual racism employed by Colin Roberts. He uses the phrase "Man Friday" to describe locals. The locals have been expelled. He said, "We don't want any Man Fridays going back to the island." In an anti-Roma slur, he talks about sea gypsies, meaning people on yachts travelling around who might visit the island. This kind of use of casual racism reported back to the State Department, reported straight, not reported as racism, is also fascinating. But what's extraordinarily sickening is the cynicism of it all. There's no attempt among these diplomats to disguise the fact that they are using fake environmentalism in order to try to turn public opinion against the Chagos Islanders, in order to stop people that they ethnically cleansed being returned to their home. Colin Roberts actually states outright that the UK government has no regrets about cleansing the island population. That's an extraordinary statement, affirmation of genocide. There's no other way of putting it. No regrets. And the Americans even express the worry that New Labour are sound on this, but the Tories may be more sympathetic to the islanders, which says all you really need to know about Tony Blair's New Labour and the extent to which it was an absolutely reliable tool of the Americans. It's a fascinating telegram. I'm sorry I've gone on so long, but I do advise you to read it because it is disgusting. Ethnic cleansing, genocide, lying to the public, fake environmental measures, greenwashing, and racism, all rolled up in one nice little package. Thank you.